Hello, okay. As introduced, I'm Dr. Hannah Farrimond. I'm from England in the UK, and I'm going to be talking about developing e-cigarette friendly services. That's the long title. The short title is A Tale of Three Services, because essentially what I'm presenting today is a series of case studies which I hope illustrate the diversity of what is happening in England, I should say, rather, not the UK. Okay, so what we're talking about here is trying to assess health professionals' attitudes towards e-cigarettes. And the existing literature essentially tells us a lot of them are still very negative. Yes, there have been shifts over time. Yes, you do see progression towards some more positive attitudes, but essentially it's still, even amongst specialists, really quite negative. This is then a problem if you want to have e-cigarette friendly services, if indeed your advisors are not e-cigarette friendly. So the period of time that I'm looking at is really from the Public Health England 2015 seminal report onwards. That's the time I've started assessing whether these services, and I haven't assessed all of the services in the UK, you'll see which ones I've assessed in a minute, okay? But I'm particularly interested in seeing how those national policy interventions and guidelines then impact in practice. Okay, so what is an e-cigarette friendly service? The definition I've taken here is from the National Centre for Smoking Cessation and Training. And in 2016, they issued guidance, essentially. I think it was the first guidance in the world that said, hey, you could be e-cigarette friendly, and this is what it might look like. And the definition which they used is an e-cigarette friendly service is one that supports clients who want to use an e-cigarette to help them quit, in other words, welcomes them as they come forward with their e-cigarettes, but also critically reaches out to smokers considering using an e-cigarette to come to the service for behavioural support. So I feel there are two components in there. So my research that I've conducted is funded by Cancer Research UK. It's qualitative data. There have been quite a lot of surveys, and we thought it would be interesting to take an in-depth approach to hear what people are actually saying and the language they're using about e-cigarette within practice. I interviewed 25 members of staff from across 8 services in the southwest, very broad southwest region of England. Okay, I only stopped collecting data 2 or 3 months ago, so it's relatively recent. And I think it's important to say that I was conducting semi-structured interviews and I did a thematic analysis, but what I'm presenting is a series of case studies. Now, the first 2 case studies are composites. In other words, they're not named services. They're mixed up of different services and different advisors and commissions and so forth. The third case study is a real service, and that's Bristol, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about them. And you might say, well, why have you picked on Bristol? It's because they were the only service doing those particular activities, so I couldn't make them into a composite, and they're happy to be named in this research. So one thing that was actually quite startling to me, and perhaps the journey that I'm going to tell you about, or the process that I'm going to tell you about, will make this apparent, was to the extent that services welcomed vapers, they were all welcoming in some sense. In other words, there wasn't a service at the time I was doing the research that actually stopped e-cigarette users coming forward for behavioural support or said, that's not our type of thing. So, for example, this commissioner says, we do say our service is e-cigarette friendly, so if someone wanted to come to quit smoking using e-cigarette, we would welcome them into the services. Obviously, we wouldn't recommend any particular cigarette, so then we're getting into language about not recommending, but we would provide the behavioural support. So to some extent, there was a baseline of welcoming, if you like, in that they weren't actually stopping them at the doors, if you like. So I've labelled these services myself. They didn't call themselves reluctant. I've labelled them reluctant, okay? So this is the first case study I'm going to look at. And I think it's fair to say that services that fell into this category had moved a very long way in a very short time frame. So they'd moved from really seeing e-cigarettes as almost taboo. That was the word they used. They're taboo. We don't do that here. I phoned one up about 6 months, just when I was starting out on my field work, and said, hi there, I'd like to speak to somebody. I'm going to be conducting research on e-cigarettes. And they said, we don't have anything to do with that here. Okay, it was, no, that's not us, okay? But when I went back 6 months later and actually started conducting research with them, they'd had training days, that they were talking more about the guidance, and actually things had shifted even in that really really short time frame. But the other thing I noticed was a lot of these services just never mentioned they were e-cigarette friendly, okay? So they would welcome people if they showed up with, I don't know, a second generation vape pen or whatever, but they didn't tell anybody. So how on earth would anybody know they were e-cig friendly if they didn't label themselves as such? There was also a divergence between the management position, so by managers I'm talking about managers, tobacco leads, commissioners, people who are sort of doing local policy, and the advisors on the ground who saw people on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of those advisors still had concerns that run along these lines. Okay? The two sets of concerns won't come as any surprise to you, okay? The first is their concern that they're addictive, okay? They can't get over the addiction, and they also find then they're concerned about the habit-forming nature. And even more intriguingly, I found that at least one service was actually helping vapers to stop vaping, okay? It was a little bit of a secret, and when I told the manager and said, do you know that some of your staff are working with vapers and trying to help them quit vaping by using NRT? They were like, we're not a stop vaping service. So obviously they'd moved away from their core mission, but their concerns about addictiveness continued. And secondly, we come back to the point, I've labelled this as a duty of care issue. That's how they framed it. I'm not saying it's a duty of care issue, I'm saying they reframed it in that terms. These aren't licensed products, the NICE guidelines don't have them listed as interventions. We just feel we can't necessarily recommend this to our clients. So that was the most reluctant service. We started with reluctant, and we're moving forward. The second type of service that I've encountered was what I've termed motivated. They were motivated, they just weren't quite sure what to do, I suppose, is how I would frame it, okay? So they were much more proactive in reaching out, and they'd done some really positive things. So a lot of the advisors or managers or commissioners, they'd gone to the local vape shops, okay, and they'd visited them, and they'd really enjoyed their experiences, actually. Another service I talked to had someone from a chain of vape shops come in and talk to them every year about the technology and how it was changing. And all of these encounters actually left services more positive, not less positive. So these were good encounters. However, what they were struggling with is, how do we then move that to more formal alliances? Or how do we move that towards plans where we could actually work together? And that's what they seem to be struggling with. Although there was, as I say, a real strong motivation, because in England, hospitals are going smoke-free, and that means not even smoking on grounds. And so a lot of the psychiatric population who would have, with mental health needs would have still perhaps smoked, and they're very concerned about what they could do in relation to that. And as I say, this one manager was telling me e-cigarettes is the thing that's screaming out, but they're just not sure how to get there, and that seems to be a problem for some services. Having said that, the other thing that stood out enormously was the importance of public health leadership. I can't really overstate this, because when I looked through the transcripts, pretty much every manager, every commissioner, every advisor said to me, it's these people that have made the difference. So it was Peter Hayek, Robert West, I'm just mentioning them off the top of my head, Linda Bold, we've got Louise Ross over there from Leicester. They talked about you in their transcripts. It is genuinely transformative. And also the guidance from Public Health England, which was very clear and gave a specific percentage that's stuck in everybody's brain, however contentious it is, okay, that gave them a sort of medical legitimacy, is the way I would describe it, and guidance, which I think they were requiring in this sector. This particular manager says, as a service, I say comparatively, we were cautious to perhaps some other areas that were a bit more gung-ho. And then, as you know, Public Health England have come back out and endorsed them. So obviously on the back of that, we've been a lot more e-cigarette friendly. The major problem they've got now is they're quite friendly, the rest of public health is still very hostile, and that causes some problems when they go forward for funding, when they go forwards for separate vaping and smoking policies and so forth. Their public health colleagues haven't necessarily read the memo. Finally, I'd like to talk about one particular service. This isn't the only service, I'd like to say, that's offering e-cigarette vouchers in the UK, and there was other services doing amazing work. I'm talking about Bristol because that was in the region, and it was the only service in the region doing something as proactive as this. Now, by cautionary notice, they'd be the first to admit they don't quite know how to structure this in some ways. And it's been an experiment and a journey for them of finding out how best to try and help people. But what I think is clear is that they're very proactive. So essentially, they introduced an e-cigarette voucher scheme. I think they get £25. It's not actually a really huge amount. And it was a very devolved system. So it's not actually a standardised offer. Everybody doesn't get the same e-cigarette. They get a voucher, and they can use it in their local vape shops. And there could be lots of issues with that. You don't know what the local vape shops are like. However, they are serving the most disadvantaged and needy areas in Bristol. And one of the commission said to me, no one will travel for this. Okay, if they can't go into a local vape shop, that's going to be a really big problem. So it's very much embedded within the community. And the key motivating factor, which I think is fairly obvious, is or what they all talk about is in terms of social justice goals. Okay, we can meet, we know now that our hard to reach populations are the disadvantaged, people with psychiatric problems and other mental health needs, pregnant women who perhaps fear judgment coming into services and so forth. All of these people are the ones they want to reach out to. And so that's what's driving them. They're not, again, like I say, there isn't a perfect model of how to do it, but they feel compelled to go forward because the social need is so great. We have to do something different. So this manager tells us, we have to do something different. We've got areas of the city where smoking rates are at 35%, and these people, they're not engaging with what we're currently offering. So their quest to do something different is driving them forward. Now, one issue, I'm sure it's not just in England, is that services are quite fragmented, and it's difficult that local councils commission them, and there isn't a standardised offer across the country. So a lot of people kept saying, Bristol, that sounds interesting, but they didn't really know about it or how they were funding it. So there's a lot more, I think, that we could do in terms of disseminating what that looks like in practice. Academic journals, they don't want to always print that stuff, I found, okay? So there might be other ways we need to think about disseminating information. So to conclude, there is no one definition of being e-cigarette friendly, not currently anyway, in England. But I really agree strongly with Lipsky's assessment of policy. Policy is what people do. It isn't just about what's written in a report, although that can be very influential, or what's in guidance. It's literally, if you want to be cigarette friendly, you have to be friendly in every one of those little micro-social interactions, as we say in sociology, where someone rings on the phone and asks about it, or someone gets out a really old vape pen, and just being friendly is what makes an e-cigarette friendly service. The guidance is there, and I would just like to finish in saying that the other key thing, of course, is that strong public health leadership is very influential for health professionals, and I think that's also where we need to focus. Thank you very much.